The most powerful survival skills in history were not dramatic. They were ordinary, and we do not use them anymore. If you are listening at night, tell me where you are and what time it is. Welcome to Dreamy Old Stories, where we share slow and gentle stories from history. These stories are made to calm your mind and help you fall asleep. As the story continues, the pace stays slow and calm. There is no hurry, only the quiet passing of time. You can listen closely, or let the sound fade as the night moves gently forward. Morning arrives again, as quietly as before. A thin light spreads across the sky. The settlement wakes in layers. A door opens. A pot shifts gently against stone. Somewhere water is lifted in a steady motion. By now we have sat beside farming, travel, craft, and care. Today we turn toward another quiet layer of everyday skill. The skill of memory and teaching without formal classrooms. Long ago, most knowledge was carried in people rather than written on pages. Memory was not optional. It was essential. There was skill in remembering long sequences of instruction. Not because people had stronger minds in a mystical sense, but because repetition was woven into daily life. A child might hear the same planting, guidance each season, the same warnings about certain plants, the same directions to distant water. Repetition carved pathways in the mind. Stories served as storage. A tale about a traveler who ignored a certain landmark was not just entertainment. It preserved geographic detail. A story about a careless farmer reminded listeners of proper timing. Practical knowledge lived inside narrative. There was skill in speaking clearly enough to be remembered. Elders often used rhythm in their sentences. Not formal poetry, but a natural cadence that made words easier to recall. Listening was equally skilled. Children were taught to sit quietly when instruction was given, not through harsh command, but through example. They watched adults listen, attentively, and copied that posture. Memory was reinforced through demonstration. A young person learning to weave did not rely on verbal explanation alone. They watched hands closely. The pattern repeated again and again until their own fingers followed naturally. Correction was gentle and immediate. A small mistake in tying a knot was adjusted before it hardened into habit. Over time, precision developed without pressure. There were also skills in remembering faces and family ties. In small communities, recognizing kinship mattered. Relationships shaped cooperation and support. Memory preserved these connections. Seasonal cycles were remembered collectively. When the first frost had come in previous years, when certain flowers bloomed, these patterns guided planning. Without written calendars, the sky served as reference. The return of certain stars at dusk marked a shift in season. These celestial observations were remembered through shared watching over many years. There was skill in dividing complex tasks into simple, remembered steps. A potter might teach an apprentice to first center the clay, then shape the base, then lift the walls. Each stage learned in order, repeated until steady dot songs sometimes carried instructions. A short chant might describe the steps of preparing a fishing net or preserving food. The melody supported memory. In marketplaces or gatherings, news was repeated multiple times to ensure accuracy. A message passed through several mouths required careful listening at each stage. Clarification was asked calmly if confusion arose. There was skill in adapting memory to new situations. If a familiar river changed course slightly after heavy Rain, travelers adjusted their mental maps. Memory was not rigid. It evolved. Even disputes were remembered carefully. Agreements spoken aloud were recalled later if needed. Witnesses carried shared memory of what had been said. In households, recipes were memorized through participation. Measuring by sight and touch replaced written instructions. Over time, quantities became intuitive. Children learned responsibility. Gradually, an older sibling might remember to check water storage at sunset. Another might recall which tools needed sharpening before morning. Memory supported daily rhythm. This reliance on memory created attentiveness. People listened carefully, because forgetting had consequences. A missed instruction could lead to wasted food or unnecessary danger. As the sun rises higher in this imagined morning, daily tasks resume. But beneath the visible work lies this invisible structure of remembered knowledge, the skill of holding information steadily in the mind shaped ancient life deeply. It allowed continuity across generations. We sit quietly beside this layer of forgotten ability. The air warms gently, and there are still more. Everyday skills waiting to be noticed as the day unfolds. By the time the sun reaches its steady height, the work of the day feels balanced and familiar. Voices move through open spaces in calm tones. Tools rise and fall in predictable rhythm. Beneath these visible motions, memory continues to guide almost everything. There was skill in remembering not only instructions, but timing. A farmer knew roughly how many days had passed since planting without counting them on paper. The change in leaf height, the firmness of stems, the smell of soil after watering all offered quiet signals. Memory was tied to the senses. The scent of ripening fruit reminded someone that harvests would soon begin. The particular feel of cool morning air suggested that colder nights were approaching. These impressions were stored and compared against past seasons. There was also skill in remembering shared obligations. If one family helped another repair a roof, the gesture was not forgotten. Support moved back and forth over time. No written contracts were needed. Reputation and memory carried weight. In craft traditions, apprentices memorized sequences through repetition. A metal worker might strike heated iron in a certain pattern again and again until the rhythm felt natural. The body remembered as clearly as the mind. Storytelling remained central. Even ordinary events were sometimes shaped into narrative form so they could be retold accurately. A traveler returning from another settlement described landmarks in order, repeating them until listeners could picture the route clearly. Children practiced memory through small tasks, being asked to fetch 3 items from storage without forgetting. 1. Remembering to close a gate at dusk. These were quiet exercises in responsibility. There was skill in remembering weather patterns across years. Which winter had been harsh, which spring brought late frost. These recollections guided caution in future seasons. Even social harmony relied on memory. Remembering a kind act strengthened bonds. Remembering a harsh word might require reconciliation. Communities survived through this ongoing awareness. In places where writing existed but was limited, only a few individuals might record events. The majority still depended on spoken repetition. Accuracy was maintained by collective correction. If a detail was wrong, someone gently clarified it. Memory also guided craftsmanship beyond daily routine. A builder might remember how a previous structure withstood heavy wind and adjust design accordingly. experience layered upon experience. There was skill in forgetting as well. Minor offenses allowed to fade, small mistakes overlooked to preserve peace. Memory was selective when necessary. Midday light begins to soften slightly as we continue observing this quiet world. Work does not stop, but its intensity shifts. Knowledge passed through generations because it was used constantly. Unused information faded naturally. What remained was what proved necessary. Even songs carried layered memory. A melody repeated at planting seasons signaled the time of year. A harvest song reminded workers of timing and rhythm. The tune anchored instruction in sound. Travelers memorized distances by counting steps or measuring time between landmarks. These methods were simple but reliable when practiced often on homes. Memory guided preparation for future days. A mother might recall that supplies ran low the previous winter and store a little extra this season. Adjustments were subtle. There was also skill in remembering the feel of proper tension in rope or thread. The hands sensed when something was too loose or too tight because they remembered. Correct balance from before. As afternoon leans gently toward evening, the steady reliance on memory continues. Beneath visible activity, the ancient world held vast networks of knowledge without shelves of books. It rested inside people, carried in voices, gestures, habits, and shared routines. We remain within this rhythm, noticing how memory shaped nearly every task. Without drawing attention to itself, the day moves forward calmly, as the day begins, too. Quiet once more, memory settles into its evening rhythm. The sun lowers gradually. Light stretches across the ground in long, soft lines. Work that required brightness winds down, and attention turns inward. Evening was often a time when memory was gently reinforced. Stories were told again, not because they were new, but because repetition preserved them. A familiar tale about a harsh winter reminded listeners to prepare early. A story about a traveler who followed the wrong star quietly reinforced navigation. Knowledge. There was skill in telling these stories without sounding like instruction. Lessons were woven into narratives so naturally that they did not feel heavy. Children absorbed them while resting near the fire. Elders sometimes corrected small details softly. A location adjusted. A season clarified. These refinements maintained accuracy across generations. Memory also shaped daily planning for tomorrow. Someone might speak aloud the tasks awaiting morning, not as a list, but as casual reflection. We will check the fence near the east field. We will gather wood before the air grows cold. Saying it once helped fix it in the mind. There was skill in recognizing when memory required support. In some places, small carved marks or arranged stones acted as reminders. Not complex writing, but simple cues. A notch might indicate a count. A pattern of pebbles might mark stored quantities. These aids did not replace memory. They strengthened it in craftwork. Patterns were repeated often enough that they no longer required conscious recall. A weaver's hands moved across threads in sequence learned long ago. The mind rested while the body remembered. There was also skill in remembering names across Widekin networks. This preserved alliances and avoided conflict. Forgetting someone's place in the web of relationships could cause tension, so family lines were repeated during gatherings. Music played a role as well. A melody carried words more securely than speech alone. Songs used during planting or harvesting reinforced both timing and cooperation. As night deepens, quiet reflection often followed. Not dramatic contemplation, but simple awareness of what had gone well and what might need adjustment tomorrow. This mental review strengthened future action. There was skill in letting certain memories fade. Small embarrassments were allowed to pass. Minor disagreements softened with time. Memories served stability, not constant conflict. Children, lying near warmth, listened again to stories they already knew. The repetition built confidence. Familiarity created comfort. In this way, ancient communities preserved vast stores of knowledge. Without libraries, the skill was not only in remembering, but in passing memory gently from one generation to the next. As embers glow beneath ash, the spoken word quiets. Memory rests for the night, but does not disappear. It waits to guide the next morning's tasks. Many of these everyday memory skills have shifted in modern life. Writing and digital storage carry much of what once lived in the mind. Convenience has reduced the need for constant recall. Yet there was something steady in holding knowledge personally, in listening carefully because forgetting mattered. The fire lowers slowly. Another day closes in this quiet world, shaped by remembered patterns and shared understanding. We move gently forward from here, knowing there are still more forgotten everyday skills resting beyond this evening. For now, the night settles fully, and memory, like the embers beneath ash, remains quietly alive. Morning returns once again, patient and unremarkable. A faint glow spreads along the horizon. The air is cool and still. Doors open quietly. Footsteps press into earth that has known many seasons. We have moved through farming, travel, care, and memory. Now we sit beside another layer of everyday skill. The skill of building and maintaining simple structures that shape daily life. Long ago, shelter was not purchased. It was created and renewed through steady hands. There was skill in selecting the right place to build. Slight elevation prevented flooding. Proximity to water reduced long walks. Protection from strong prevailing wind improved comfort. These choices were made by observation rather than calculation. Ground was prepared carefully. Loose soil packed down. Stones removed or arranged as foundation. Even without complex tools, the base needed to be level. A slight tilt created long-term strain. Wooden frames were assembled with attention to balance. Vertical posts set firmly into earth. Horizontal beams resting evenly across supports. A beam that leaned even slightly out of line could weaken the whole structure. So builders stepped back often, viewing their work from different angles. There was skill in joining wood without modern fasteners. Pegs, carved from harder branches, were shaped to fit snugly into drilled holes. A tight joint required careful carving and patience. Too loose and it wobbled. Too tight and the wood split. Walls were often made from woven branches covered in clay or mud. The weaving itself required rhythm. Branches bent gently without breaking. Gaps kept small enough to hold plaster. The mixture of earth and straw pressed into place by hand. Drying time mattered. If walls dried too quickly, cracks formed. If they remained wet too long, they weakened. Builders learned to work with weather rather than against it. Roofs required careful layering. Thatch placed in overlapping rows so rain slid downward naturally. The angle had to be steep enough to shed water, but not so steep that wind lifted it away. Each bundle tied securely. Maintenance was constant. After heavy rain, roofs were inspected, loose bundles replaced, small leaks patched before they grew. Floors were leveled and compacted, sometimes covered with woven mats for warmth. These mats were aired regularly to prevent dampness. There was skill in arranging interior space efficiently. Storage near walls. Cooking area positioned to allow smoke to escape through openings. Sleeping areas placed away from drafts. In colder climates, insulation mattered. Extra layers of straw pressed into gaps. Openings covered during harsh weather. Small adjustments improved comfort through long nights. Even doors required attention. Hinges made from simple materials needed lubrication with oil or fat. A door that stuck in damp weather was adjusted carefully. Communities sometimes gathered to help build larger structures. Lifting beams required coordinated effort. No loud commands were necessary. A shared understanding guided timing. Repair was woven into daily habit. A crack in plaster smoothed over before winter. A sagging roof beam reinforced with an added support. Children learned these skills gradually, first by watching, then by carrying lighter materials, eventually by shaping parts themselves. There was pride in a well-built shelter, but it was quiet pride. The goal was durability rather than display. As the sun rises higher in this imagined morning, we notice how much attention simple shelter required. Not constant labor, but steady awareness. These everyday building skills shaped the physical world of ancient communities. Without them, comfort and safety would have been uncertain. We sit quietly beside these structures, noticing the careful placement of beam and branch, clay and straw. The day moves gently forward, and there is still more to observe. Within these walls before evening returns, by midday, the structures built with such care begin to reveal their quiet complexity. Sunlight falls across walls of clay and woven branch. The surface, though simple, carries the imprint of many hands. No two sections are exactly alike. Slight variations in texture reflect the rhythm of those who pressed the mixture into place. There was skill not only in building shelter, but in maintaining it through changing seasons. When heat expanded, small gaps appeared. When cold contracted, joints tightened. Builders learned to expect this movement. Repairs were timed according to weather. A beam adjusted in dry air behaved differently than one handled after rain. In regions where rain was frequent, drainage mattered deeply. Shallow trenches were carved around structures to guide water away from foundations. Leaves and debris cleared regularly to prevent blockage. These tasks required attention but little strength. There was knowledge in selecting clay for plaster. Some earth held together better than others. A handful squeezed firmly revealed its character. If it crumbled too easily, it needed adjustment with straw or sand. The mixture changed subtly, depending on what was available. Smoke management inside homes required quiet problem-solving. Openings positioned to allow airflow without inviting too much wind. A shift in wind direction might require adjusting the hearth slightly. The balance between warmth and ventilation was delicate. There were skills in reinforcing older structures rather than replacing them entirely. A weakened wall might be strengthened with an added support beam. A sagging roofline corrected gradually instead of dismantled completely. Storage areas were built with particular care. Elevated platforms protected grain from damp ground. Containers spaced slightly apart allowed air to circulate. Rodent access was minimized through simple barriers in colder regions. Entryways were sometimes constructed with small turns or partial partitions to reduce direct drafts. These designs were not decorative. They were practical solutions refined through experience. There was also skill in communal construction. When building larger gathering spaces, many hands worked together. Some lifted heavy beams. Others prepared materials. Timing and coordination developed through shared rhythm. Children observed these efforts closely. They saw how patience prevented collapse, how rushing caused mistakes. Over time, they absorbed these lessons without formal instruction. Even tools used in construction required upkeep. Wooden mallets replaced when cracked. Simple measuring cords kept dry to prevent stretching. A tool poorly maintained reduced accuracy. There was skill in recognizing when a structure had reached its natural end, would weaken beyond safe repair. Clay walls eroded too deeply. At that point, rebuilding began not with frustration, but acceptance. Materials from the old structure were often reused where possible. In settlements that grew slowly over generations, layers of building styles sometimes overlapped. Older techniques blended with newer adjustments. Knowledge adapted quietly. Midday warmth presses gently against walls now in our imagined scene. Inside, shade offers relief. The shelter holds its form because of countless small decisions made long before this moment. These everyday building skills shaped not only physical comfort, but emotional security. A stable roof allowed rest without constant worry. Solid walls created a sense of boundary and belonging. As the sun begins its gradual descent, maintenance continues in small ways. A loose latch tightened, a cracked plaster line smoothed over. These gestures prevent larger disruptions later. We remain beside these structures, noticing the quiet intelligence embedded in their design. The day moves steadily forward, and there is still more to consider before night returns once again. As the afternoon light begins to soften, the buildings themselves seem to change color. Clay walls take on warmer tones. Wooden beams glow gently in the lowering sun. The structures that were shaped by careful hands now settle into evening calm. There was skill in closing a structure for the night. Openings that allowed light and air during the day were adjusted. Shutters pulled inward. Simple coverings tied into place, not tightly sealed, but secured enough to guard against wind and wandering animals. In regions where temperatures dropped quickly after sunset, warmth was preserved deliberately. Doors closed before the air turned cold. Small gaps stuffed lightly with cloth or straw. These actions were small but protective. There was also skill in reading the sounds of a building. A beam that creaked differently might signal a shift in weight. A faint drip from the roof after rain required investigation before sleep. People learned the normal voice of their shelter. Any unusual sound stood out quietly. Hearths were adjusted with attention. Fire reduced to embers that would last through the night. Ash placed carefully to slow the burn without extinguishing it. Too much fuel wasted resources. Too little risked a cold morning. In shared spaces, tools used during construction or repair were gathered neatly. A hammer left outside overnight could absorb moisture. A rope exposed to dew weakened gradually, so items returned to dry corners within walls. There was skill in observing structural wear gradually over years. A slight lean in a post might be supported before it bent further. A roof edge thinned by wind was reinforced before the next storm. These habits were not performed in fear. They were part of rhythm. Children learned by participating in small ways. Holding a light while an elder adjusted a latch, carrying a handful of straw to fill a draught. These moments built familiarity with their surroundings. Even communal structures received evening attention. Meeting spaces or storage buildings checked by someone passing by. Responsibility moved quietly between individuals. Inside, the arrangement of sleeping spaces once again reflected awareness of structure. Those resting beneath the strongest beams felt secure. Bedding positioned away from walls that held lingering dampness. In places where heavy weather sometimes struck, there was skill in preparing quickly but calmly. Extra supports leaned nearby. Additional coverings kept within reach. Experience. Reduced panic. As darkness settles, more fully now, the buildings hold warmth gathered throughout the day. They stand not as monuments, but as steady companions to human life. Many of these building skills have shifted or faded in modern times. Large systems now manage heating, cooling, and structural reinforcement. Repairs are often handled by specialists, rather than by those who live within the walls. Yet for centuries, individuals understood the bones of their shelters intimately. They knew how each beam rested, how each wall responded to weather. The fire lowers gently inside one such home. Shadows climb across plastered surfaces. The structure breathes quietly with the night air. Another day shaped by building and maintaining shelter draws to a close. We move forward slowly from here, aware that still more everyday skills remain to be noticed. Skills connected to creativity, to craft beyond necessity, to small acts of beauty woven into ordinary life. For now, the settlement rests inside the structures built by careful hands, and the night deepens, steady and calm. Morning arrives again with the same gentle patience. A thin mist rests low over the ground before the sun warms it away. Light touches rooftops and fields slowly, as if testing the day before fully committing to it. Doors open, a soft cough. The scrape of wood against earth. Life resumes in familiar patterns. We have sat beside farming, healing, memory, and shelter. Now we turn toward another quiet layer of everyday skill. The skill of making beauty without separating it from usefulness. Long ago, decoration was rarely separate from function. Patterns appeared on tools, clothing, and walls, not because there was extra time, but because hands moved with rhythm even during ordinary tasks. There was skill in carving small designs into wooden handles. A simple line repeated along the grip made it less slippery. At the same time, it added a quiet pattern. The design did not announce itself loudly. It existed as part of the object. Weavers sometimes introduced subtle variations into cloth, a shift in color using natural dyes, a change in pattern across a border. These touches were small, but they signaled identity. A family might recognize its own pattern at a glance. Dyes themselves required knowledge. Plants gathered at the right season produced stronger color. Some roots boiled longer, deepened shade. Cloth soaked too briefly faded quickly. Too long and fibers weakened. The balance came through experience. Pottery occasionally carried etched markings along its rim, a repeating symbol, a simple curve. These designs did not alter function. They added quiet familiarity. There was skill in shaping everyday objects, with proportion in mind. A bowl that felt balanced in the hand, a cup that rested comfortably against the lip. These details required attention, though no one described them in technical terms. Music, too, was woven into daily life without spectacle. A simple flute carved from red, a drum stretched with animal hide. These instruments were not always played for performance. Sometimes they accompanied work softly, maintaining rhythm. Even the act of braiding hair carried careful technique. Patterns woven tightly enough to last through the day. Decorative elements added subtly. The style might indicate age, region, or family connection. Walls of homes were sometimes marked with handprints or simple painted shapes. Not grand murals, just reminders of presence. The mixture used for paint came from earthed and plant pigments. Prepared with patience, there was skill in arranging shared spaces during gatherings. Mats laid evenly, objects positioned with symmetry. The arrangement fostered calm without requiring explanation. Children learned these creative habits naturally. While helping weave, they experimented with color placement, while carving small items, they added personal marks. Creativity did not require permission. Even tools made for hard labor sometimes carried small flourishes. A curve shaped slightly more smoothly than required, a handle polished longer than necessary. These gestures reflected quiet pride. In some regions, body decoration formed part of daily expression. Simple beads strung from natural materials, shells pierced carefully. The process of creating these items required patience and fine motor. Skilled natural materials shaped artistic choices. Certain stones polished to shine, feathers added to clothing, each element selected thoughtfully. As the sun rises higher, work continues. But within that work lies subtle expression, beauty woven into necessity. These everyday creative skills did not seek applause. They were integrated into survival. They strengthened identity and community bonds quietly. We sit beside this morning light, noticing how ordinary objects hold traces of careful design. There is still much to observe as the day unfolds. By midday, light fills every open space. The mist has lifted completely. Surfaces that were cool at dawn now hold warmth. Work continues as always, yet within it, quiet creativity remains present. There was skill in shaping sound as much as shaping wood or clay. Voices carried across fields, in patterns that were not random. A call to signal distance had a certain tone. A reply carried back in matching rhythm. These vocal patterns developed naturally, shaped by landscape and habit. Songs used during labor were often simple and repetitive. Their purpose was not performance, but coordination. A steady beat helped align movement when lifting or pulling together. The rhythm reduced strain by synchronizing effort. There was skill in crafting instruments from available materials. A hollowed gourd could become a resonant chamber. A stretched hide, pulled evenly across a frame, produced a deeper tone. The tension had to be just right. Too loose and the sound dulled. Too tight and it tore. Even simple whistles carved from bone required careful shaping of the air passage. A slight adjustment changed pitch. Makers learned through trial and quiet listening. Color also played a role beyond clothing. Baskets woven from different plant fibers displayed subtle contrast. Light and dark strands arranged in patterns created visual rhythm. In some homes, storage containers were marked with symbols that indicated ownership or contents. These markings were not elaborate writing systems. They were personal signs, repeated consistently. There was skill in balancing decoration with durability. Paint applied too thickly flaked away. Etching too deeply weakened a vessel. The maker adjusted pressure and mixture accordingly. Jewelry crafted from shell or stone required careful drilling. A small hole made without cracking the material demanded steady hands. Beads were smoothed against rough surfaces to prevent discomfort against skin. Hairstyling often reflected both creativity and practicality. Braids kept hair from interfering with work. At the same time, the pattern of those braids could express individuality or belonging. Even body posture during dance held skill. In communities where dance formed part of celebration, movements were learned through observation and repetition. Balance and timing were practiced quietly long before gatherings. Children absorbed these expressive skills by watching closely. They imitated patterns in sand. They hummed melodies heard from elders. Correction came gently through demonstration. Rather than critique, tools used for creative work required maintenance like any other. A carving blade kept sharp. A loom adjusted to maintain even tension. An instrument stored away from dampness. Midday gatherings sometimes included brief moments of shared sound. A rhythm tapped on a surface. A melody hummed while weaving. These expressions blended into routine. There was also skill and restraint. Not every surface required decoration. Knowing when to leave wood plain, when to allow clay to remain smooth, reflected judgment. Creative expression strengthened connection within a group. Shared patterns identified community. Familiar songs linked generations as the afternoon advances. Sunlight shifts slightly. Shadows lengthen at the edges of walls. The work of shaping beauty within usefulness continues without fanfare. These everyday creative skills remind us that ancient life was not only about survival. It also included quiet moments of expression shaped by careful hands. We remain within this calm brightness, noticing how art and function blend seamlessly. The day continues gently forward. As the afternoon light begins to soften, color deepens across the settlement. Clay walls glow warmer. Woven cloth catches the low sun and reveals patterns that were subtle at midday. The quiet layer of creativity that lived inside daily work now feels slightly more visible. Evening often brought small gatherings, not always formal celebrations. Sometimes just a few families, sitting near one another as tasks wound down. There was skill in arranging shared space for comfort and harmony. Mats laid in a circle so everyone could see one another. A small fire positioned to give warmth evenly. Objects moved aside to create room without clutter. Music, when it appeared, did not dominate the night. A soft rhythm tapped on wood. A flute played slowly. The sound carried gently into the dark. Those who listened recognized familiar melodies. Shaped by repetition over years, there was skill in collective rhythm. When several voices joined in song, they did not compete. They adjusted to one another. Louder voices softened. Quieter ones strengthened. Balance emerged through listening, dance, In some communities, followed patterns remembered across generations. Steps repeated steadily, movements mirrored one another. There was no stage. The earth served as flawed art. Hands clapped in simple timing. Feet struck ground in measured beats. These actions required coordination and awareness, yet they felt natural. Storytelling during these hours sometimes included humor, light observations about the day, gentle teasing that strengthened bonds rather than weakened them. Knowing where humor ended and respect began was its own skill. Craft continued even during conversation. Someone might weave slowly while listening. Another might carve a small object absent-mindedly, adding detail without fully concentrating. Creativity flowed alongside social connection. There was also skill in silence within a group. Not every moment required sound. Sitting together without speaking felt comfortable. The presence of others was enough. Objects created earlier in the day might be admired quietly. A newly dyed cloth examined in firelight. A polished bead turned slowly between fingers. Appreciation did not require applause. Children often participated. At the edges of these gatherings, watching dance patterns, mimicking songs softly, learning timing and expression through proximity. As darkness deepens, light from hearths flickers across faces and walls. Patterns painted earlier seemed to move gently in shadow. There was skill in closing creative activity before fatigue set in. Instruments stored carefully, carving tools returned to their places, paint mixtures covered to prevent drying. Even celebration required moderation. Overexertion left the next day unbalanced. So gatherings ended naturally as the night grew cooler. These creative, everyday skills shaped identity quietly. They marked belonging without grand declaration. They turned necessary objects into personal ones. In modern times, creativity is often separated from routine, reserved for special occasions or specialized professions. But once, it lived inside daily repetition. As embers settle lower, voices soften, movement slows. The settlement rests again beneath the night sky. We have moved through another layer of forgotten ability, the quiet integration of beauty and usefulness. There are still more everyday skills waiting ahead. Skills tied to negotiation, to conflict resolution, to maintaining order without formal systems. For now, the music fades gently, and the night holds steady, calm and unhurried. Morning returns again, steady and unremarkable. A thin layer of cool air rests over the settlement before sunlight warms it away. The first sounds of movement begin softly. A gate opens. A bucket is lowered. A quiet voice calls across a short distance. We have sat beside farming, healing, memory, shelter, and creativity. Now we turn toward another quiet layer of everyday skill. The skill of maintaining order and resolving tension without formal systems. Long ago, most communities did not rely on written laws posted on walls. Order lived inside, shared expectation, and repeated practice. There was skill in recognizing disagreement before it became conflict, a change in tone during conversation, a prolonged silence where there was usually ease. These signals were noticed by those paying attention. When tension appeared, it was often addressed early. Two people might sit together at the edge of a field or near a hearth, voices kept low. Each person given time to speak without interruption. There was skill in listening fully, not preparing a reply while the other spoke, not raising volume to dominate. Listening itself carried authority. Elders sometimes played a quiet role in maintaining balance. Their presence alone reminded others of shared history. They did not always give commands. Often, they asked simple questions that allowed each person to reconsider their position. Memory supported fairness. Past agreements were remembered clearly. Who had promised what? When assistance had been given. This shared recollection reduced misunderstanding. There was also skill in apology. Acknowledging error without excessive pride. Accepting apology without holding resentment too long. These gestures preserved stability. Communal labor reinforced cooperation. When people worked side by side repairing a wall or harvesting grain, small grievances often softened naturally. There were unspoken boundaries respected across generations. Certain areas reserved for specific purposes. Certain behaviors discouraged not by threat, but by consistent response from the group. Children learned these social skills by observation. They watched how adults navigated disagreement. They absorbed the tone of respectful conversation. Trade required similar balance. Fair measurement built trust. Dishonesty, once noticed, spread quickly through word of mouth. Reputation shaped future opportunity. There was skill in choosing when not to escalate minor issues. A small inconvenience overlooked preserved energy. For more serious matters, in gatherings, seating sometimes reflected subtle order. Elders placed where they could see and be seen. Younger members at eggers, learning through listening. There were quiet signals used to restore calm. A hand raised gently, a pause in speech, a shift in posture. These cues redirected conversation without force. Even shared meals reinforced equality. Food distributed evenly. No one served less consistently. These small habits strengthened cohesion. As the sun rises higher in this imagined morning, daily work continues. Yet beneath it lies this delicate web of social understanding. Communities survive not only through physical skill, but through emotional intelligence practiced quietly. We sit beside this layer of forgotten ability, noticing how much stability depended on simple acts of fairness and restraint. The day moves gently forward, and there is still more to observe before evening returns. By midday, the settlement feels balanced again. Light spreads evenly across fields and walls. The mornings. Small tensions, if any appeared, have settled into routine. Work continues in its familiar rhythm, and within that rhythm, social skill continues quietly. There was once a steady ability to negotiate without written contracts. When two people exchanged goods, they looked at one another carefully. Tone mattered. Posture mattered. A slight nod could confirm agreement. A pause might suggest hesitation. These signals were read with attention. Value was often discussed calmly. A measure of grain offered for a tool. A length of cloth exchanged for dried fish. The conversation rarely rushed. Each side considered fairness in relation to previous exchanges remembered over time. There was skill in compromise. If one item fell slightly short of expectation, an additional small offering might balance it. The adjustment preserved relationship more than strict precision would have. Disputes over boundaries or shared resources required patience. Neighbors walked the edge of a field together, pointing out markers placed seasons earlier. Stones moved by heavy rain were repositioned through mutual agreement. Witnesses sometimes joined quietly, not to dominate, but to support clarity. Collective memory reduced confusion. There was also skill in hosting visitors from nearby settlements. Greeting them with modest hospitality signaled openness. Offering water or a simple meal before beginning discussion created ease. In larger gatherings, decisions affecting the whole group were discussed aloud. Not everyone spoke at once. Often, the most experienced waited until others had expressed themselves. This restraint encouraged broader participation. There were unspoken methods of restoring balance when someone acted unfairly. A subtle withdrawal of cooperation. A gentle reminder spoken in private. Public confrontation was used sparingly. Children observed these interactions closely. They learned when to speak and when to remain silent. They saw how patience prevented escalation. There was skill in reading body language across distance. A raised hand from across a field could signal readiness or request. A certain posture might indicate agreement without needing words. In trade journeys between settlements, trust extended beyond immediate family. Reputation traveled through repeated encounters. A traveler known for fairness was welcomed more easily. There was also skill in acknowledging difference. Customs varied slightly between groups. Rather than insisting on uniform practice, many adapted respectfully when entering another community. Midday heat presses gently against the earth. Now, in our imagined scene, work slows slightly in shaded areas, but conversation continues. Even humor played a role in social balance. Light teasing could ease tension if delivered carefully. Knowing the boundary between playful and harmful required sensitivity. Apologies, when necessary, were often brief and direct. A simple admission carried weight when supported by consistent behavior afterward. There was skill in forgiveness that preserved long-term stability. Holding on to every small offense would fracture a small community quickly. So minor errors were allowed to fade. As afternoon approaches, the web of relationships remains intact because of countless small decisions made throughout the day. These social abilities rarely appear in formal records, yet they were as essential as farming or building. We remain within this calm daylight, noticing how order emerged not from strict enforcement, but from shared understanding. The day moves forward steadily, and there is still one more quiet layer to consider before this part closes. As the afternoon light begins to lower, conversations grow softer. The work of the day continues, but its intensity eases. The web of relationships that held the community together has been tested in small ways and strengthened. Again, through quiet adjustment, evening was often the time when unresolved matters were settled gently. If tension lingered between two people, someone might suggest sitting together after tasks were finished. Not as a formal hearing, just a quiet conversation near a hearth or beneath open sky. There was skill in choosing the right moment, addressing disagreement too early while tempers were warm risked deepening conflict. Waiting until calm returned allowed clearer thought. Listening remained central. Each person spoke while the other waited. Interruptions were rare. Silence between sentences was accepted, giving space for reflection. There was skill in reading the weight of words. Some phrases softened conflict, others hardened it. Experienced members of a community learned to choose language that restored balance rather than challenged pride. In shared spaces, small gestures reinforced harmony. Offering food to someone with whom one had disagreed signaled goodwill. Accepting it signaled readiness to move forward. Communal activities in the evening often restored unity naturally. Shared music, simple games, storytelling, laughter that included rather than excluded. There was also skill in acknowledging hierarchy without abuse of power. Elders guided gently. Leaders, where they existed, often led by example rather than command. Memory played a role here as well. Past cooperation reminded individuals of mutual dependence. A harvest completed together. A roof repaired collectively. These shared efforts discouraged lasting division. When larger decisions affected the whole group, discussion might extend across several evenings. Patience prevented rash action. Agreement reached slowly tended to last longer. There was skill in letting minor disputes dissolve without formal resolution. Not every difference required a clear winner. Sometimes shared labor the next morning was enough to smooth remaining edges. Children observed how adults restored calm. They learned that disagreement was not the same as permanent separation. Even tone of voice at day's end mattered. Speaking gently before sleep preserved peace through the night. As darkness settles now in our imagined settlement, the community rests with its balance intact. These everyday social skills allowed small groups to survive without constant oversight. They relied on trust, patience, memory, and restraint. Morning returns once more, familiar and unhurried. A pale light spreads slowly across the land. The air feels steady, neither too cold nor too warm. Doors open as they have many times before. Footsteps move across earth that remembers countless seasons. We've walked through farming, healing, memory, shelter, creativity, and quiet social balance. In this final part, we sit beside something even simpler. The skill of living within limits. Long ago, most people understood the boundaries of their world clearly, not because they lacked imagination, but because daily life made limits visible. There was skill in recognizing how much grain could be consumed without endangering. Winter stores. A jar half empty was not ignored. It was noticed calmly. Portions adjusted slightly over time. Firewood was stacked with awareness of the coming cold. Each log burned was felt as part of a larger measure. Waste was rare, not from strict rule, but from habit. Water carried from a stream or well was used thoughtfully. A cup poured carefully. Excess avoided. The effort required to gather it shaped behavior naturally. There was skill in using tools until they truly reached their end. A blade sharpened many times before replacement. A garment patched repeatedly before discarded. Objects lived long lives because attention sustained them. In agriculture, limits were visible in soil. Overuse reduced yield. Rest restored strength. Farmers learned to pause rather than push beyond what land could offer. There was also skill in pacing labor across seasons. Planting required energy early in the year. Harvest demanded strength later. Winter brought repair and preparation. The body moved in cycles rather than constant acceleration. Communities understood the limits of their surroundings. Hunting balanced with breeding seasons. Fishing adjusted when numbers fell. These decisions were not always perfect, but awareness existed. Even trade reflected limits. Carrying too much burdened the traveler, seeking too much risked imbalance at home. Moderation preserved steadiness. There was skill in contentment with sufficiency. Not every desire required fulfillment. A well-functioning tool satisfied its purpose without decoration beyond need. Time itself felt bounded by daylight. When darkness fell, activity slowed. Rest was not delayed endlessly. Children grew up understanding these patterns. They saw that resources required effort. They learned that patience extended supplies. In homes, leftovers were reused thoughtfully. Stale bread softened in broth. Scraps repurposed for animal feed. Very little was wasted entirely. There was also skill in emotional restraint. Anger carried cost. Excessive pride disrupted cooperation. Moderation in behavior supported stability. As the sun rises higher in this imagined final morning, we notice how deeply limit shaped ancient life, not as restriction, but as rhythm. Living within visible boundaries created a form of balance. It required attention, but not constant anxiety. Many of these everyday skills of limitation have softened in modern systems where supply often feels distant from effort. Resources arrive without visible origin. Waste can feel abstract, yet once limits were clear, and skill lay in respecting them quietly. The day continues forward calmly, and there is still more to settle into before this long journey comes gently to rest on. By midday, the light stands high and steady. The settlement moves in its familiar rhythm. Nothing dramatic marks this final stretch of our quiet walk. The same sounds repeat. The same small motions continue. Yet beneath them, the skill of living within limits remains present in every gesture. There was once a steady awareness of how much a body could do in a single day. Work began early, but it did not push endlessly without pause. People sensed when muscles grew heavy. They shifted tasks rather than forcing strain. A person who ignored fatigue risked injury that would last far longer than a single afternoon. So restraint was practical. There was skill in sharing limited resources without counting every portion allowed. Food divided evenly as possible. When supplies ran thin, portions reduced slightly for everyone rather than drastically for one. Communities learned to adjust quietly to scarcity. A dry season meant planting more carefully. A poor harvest meant stretching meals with additional grains or roots. Adaptation was gradual. There was also skill in accepting uncertainty. Weather could not be controlled. Crops sometimes failed despite preparation. Illness arrived without warning. Within these limits, people focused on what could be influenced and released what could not. Tools reflected this mindset. A simple hoe did not attempt to do every task. It served its purpose well. Expectations remained aligned with reality. Homes were built according to available material. Stone where stone was plentiful, wood where forests stood near. Ambition rarely extended beyond what land could support. In trade, restraint appeared again. Agreements were made within reasonable bounds. Attempting to demand too much damaged trust. Seeking fair exchange sustained connection. Even storytelling reflected limits. Tales often reminded listeners of consequences when boundaries were ignored. A hunter who took too much game. A traveler who ventured too far without preparation. These stories carried quiet caution. Midday heat presses gently across the fields now in our imagined settlement. Activity slows slightly, not from weakness, but from understanding. There was skill in conserving energy for tomorrow. A fence could be repaired partially today and completed later if daylight faded. Not every task required immediate completion. In relationships, limits were respected as well. Space given when someone required solitude. Advice offered, but not forced. Overstepping boundaries risked tension. Children absorbed this awareness by watching. They learned that impatience often created more work later. That waiting sometimes protected what mattered. Waste was noticed quickly. A spilled measure of grain gathered carefully rather than swept aside. A broken handle repaired before replacement was considered. There was also skill in quiet gratitude, not as a grand expression, but as recognition of sufficiency. A roof that did not leak, a meal that satisfied hunger. These were enough. As afternoon approaches, the light begins its slow descent again. The patterns of limit continue guiding action. Modern life often masks limits behind layers of systems and supply chains. But once, boundaries were visible and personal. Skill lay in adjusting behavior accordingly. We remain here in the calm brightness, noticing how moderation shaped stability. The day moves steadily toward evening, and there is one final quiet settling still ahead before this long journey closes. The light lowers once more. Shadows lengthen slowly across the ground. The air cools in a way that feels familiar now. Doors close gently. Tools are returned to their resting places. The rhythm that has carried us through so many quiet days begins to settle. There is no grand ending in this ancient world, only another. Evening, the final layer of everyday skill, is perhaps the simplest. The skill of ending the day without urgency. Long ago, when light faded, work faded with it. Not from exhaustion alone, but from understanding. Darkness was a boundary that invited rest. There was skill in allowing tasks to remain unfinished when night arrived. A half-repaired tool could wait until morning. A basket not fully woven would still be there at dawn. Trust in tomorrow reduced strain today. Fire was lowered carefully. Embers gathered inward. Ash placed gently on top to preserve warmth without waste. The motion had been repeated thousands of times before. It required no thoughts, only attention. Water was set within reach for morning. Doors secured in simple ways. Animals checked once more. These closing gestures formed a quiet ritual. There was skill in releasing small frustrations before sleep. A difficult exchange during the day allowed to soften overnight. Rest cleared sharp edges. In homes, conversation slowed naturally. Voices dropped in volume. Stories shortened. Silence grew comfortable. Children drifted into sleep, listening to the steady breathing of those around them. Adults lay down, knowing that the same patterns would begin again with sunrise. Life moved in cycles, not straight lines. The lost everyday skills we have walked beside were never extraordinary in isolation. Grinding grain, tying rope, listening carefully, repairing walls, remembering stories, sharing fairly, respecting limits. Each skill was small. Together, they formed resilience. Over time, many of these abilities faded or transformed. Technology absorbed certain tasks. Specialization replaced broad competence. Systems grew larger than individual awareness, yet the quiet knowledge once held in ordinary hands shaped centuries of human survival. Tonight, as the final light disappears, we do not conclude with summary or judgment. We simply notice how much steadiness existed in repetition, how much intelligence lived in routine, how much balance rested in attention. The settlement grows still. Embers glow faintly beneath ash. The sky darkens fully. Morning will return again, though we will not follow it further now. The forgotten everyday skills of ancient people remain, not lost entirely, but resting beneath modern life like foundations, beneath newer walls. We leave them here in the quiet. The night holds steady, and everything settles gently into calm.